In the winter of 1944, Germany was about to lose the war. Allied planes filled the sky above the Rhineland. The Russian army pushed toward the Vistula River. Hitler's last big attack in the west, the Ardennes offensive, was already failing. Inside Berlin, though, Josef Goebbels refused to admit things were falling apart. He was in charge of propaganda and had once been good at making Hitler look good. Now, he was trying to keep people believing in a leader and a cause that were clearly failing. Goebbels had always thought that words were as strong as armies. He had made his career by turning Hitler's ideas into a unifying story, mixing fear, ego, and anger. But by 1944, that story was losing its power. Cities were destroyed. Soldiers were surrendering in huge numbers. People, even in the army, were starting to doubt Hitler, who had once been seen as perfect. Goebbels knew this was dangerous. He thought the government could only survive if Germans kept believing that Hitler was the country's destiny. His job was to make that belief seem not just reasonable, but like a sacred duty. When someone tried to kill Hitler on July 20th, Goebbels saw a chance. The bomb that almost killed Hitler at his headquarters gave him a way to bring back the idea that Hitler was protected by God, like in the early years. Within hours, he ordered the radio and newspapers to announce that fate had saved Hitler. Newspapers printed pictures of the injured Hitler shaking hands with officers, his arm in a bandage, his face serious but strong. The message was clear: not even betrayal and bombs could harm the man chosen by fate. Goebbels called it a miracle of faith and loyalty, but he knew it was also a lucky break. The failed coup allowed him to get rid of the officers who doubted Hitler and to get the people excited with anger. He used the radio to call for revenge without mercy. In the weeks that followed, the People's Court, led by Roland Freiler, carried out his wishes in a scary way. The propaganda ministry broadcast the trials, turning the executions into a public show. Goebbels said the executions proved that the country was united and that betrayal would only make Germany stronger. But he knew the truth. The war was going badly. As the Russian army moved through Poland and Romania, Goebbels started talking more about staying strong than about winning. In September 1944, he wrote that the country had to become strong-willed. His newspapers started calling Germany not a country, but a defended stronghold surrounded by enemies. This was like the total war idea he had talked about in his speech a year before, when he had asked if people wanted a total war, even more total than they could imagine. Now, he used that tone again, but it felt different. In 1943, there was still some hope, but in 1944, there was only desperation. Goebbels' writings talked about sacrifice, loyalty, and God punishing those who were cowards. He was creating a new story. Even if they couldn't win, they could at least turn their defeat into something honorable. As German cities burned, Goebbels became obsessed with controlling information. He ordered that no one could mention retreats until they were unavoidable. Newspapers were told to focus on small victories, even if they were just tactical moves that were made to sound like successful plans. Even when the Allies broke through in Normandy and started taking over France, Goebbels insisted that newspapers say it was just fierce fighting. He preferred to create an illusion than to let people panic. He thought losing hope was worse than any bomb. But he was losing control. British and American radio broadcasts, which many Germans secretly listened to, sounded calm and certain, which his propaganda couldn't match. Still, he wouldn't admit defeat in words. When his own people suggested that being honest might work better, he told them that truth was only for those who weren't at war. In October 1944, as Russian forces entered East Prussia, Goebbels made his broadcasts even more emotional. He said the Russian army was a bunch of violent killers who would destroy German civilization. The propaganda used real events, but blew them up into an almost unbelievable vision. Posters warned that Bolshevism brings death. The goal was clear. Fear could unite people when hope couldn't. The ministry worked with the SS to spread stories of massacres, emphasizing the fate that awaited any German who surrendered. Goebbels believed that fear of the enemy would keep morale high even if people stopped loving Hitler. But his relationship with Hitler was getting worse. Hitler still respected Goebbels' loyalty, but was suspicious of anyone who suggested different ideas. Goebbels wanted Hitler to allow controlled evacuations of cities and to let propaganda prepare people for strategic retreats. Hitler refused, saying that any talk of retreat was defeatism. Their meetings in late 1944 became difficult, with Goebbels trying to balance Hitler's unrealistic orders with the failing battle lines. Still, he kept shaping Hitler's image. When Hitler finally appeared in public in March 1945 for his last look at the Hitler Youth Defenders in Berlin, Goebbels planned every detail. The cameras were placed low to make Hitler look strong, and the news clips were edited to emphasize cheering crowds. To the world, it was supposed to look like the country was strong again. To those who were there, it felt like a performance in the ruins. Goebbels also tried to use hope as a weapon. In the final months, he spread stories of new amazing weapons that would turn the war around. The V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the submarine wolf packs supposedly planning a final attack. He knew the technology existed, but greatly exaggerated how many there were. His press releases talked about the miracles of German making, suggesting that these weapons were already being mass-produced. The idea of secret weapons became the last thing holding the government together. Even as people in Berlin saw Russian artillery in the distance, the radio promised help from laboratories and bunkers. Goebbels was no longer shaping reality, but protecting the government from it. By early 1945, his broadcasts sounded almost religious. Hitler was no longer just a leader, but the symbol of God's justice. Goebbels talked about him in grand terms, saying the war was a test of faith. He quoted the Bible, comparing Germany's suffering to Christ's suffering, and said that a new world would rise from the ruins. These weren't just the words of a crazy man, but calculated words meant to turn despair into devotion. If Germany couldn't win, it could at least die believing it had served a higher purpose. This idea, which mixed nationalism with self-sacrifice, would later justify the suicidal defense of cities like Koigberg and Berlin, where propaganda told people to fight with crazy faith in Hitler. Inside the propaganda ministry, though, morale was collapsing. Reports from local leaders painted a bad picture. People disobeying, soldiers running away, even the murder of party leaders. Goebbels ordered harsh punishments for anyone who spoke negatively, allowing local propaganda officers to work with the Gestapo. In one memo, he wrote that words had to be as deadly as bullets. He kept writing editorials until the very end, still signing them with his black ink, still calling Hitler the soul of the nation. But his own diary showed that he was becoming fatalistic. He admitted that the war was lost, but said it was better to die with honor than to live under occupation. This fatalism was itself a type of propaganda. He put his own despair onto the country and called it resolve. In April 1945, as Russian tanks reached the edge of Berlin, Goebbels moved his family into Hitler's bunker. Even then, he insisted on broadcasting daily news, claiming that relief armies were coming. He knew they weren't. When Hitler told him he would stay in Berlin and fight to the end, Goebbels said that the German people deserved their fate. But, in public, he kept up the illusion that salvation was near. He still controlled the radio station inside the chancellery and called for resistance. The last broadcasts were almost drowned out by the sound of artillery, urging Berliners to defend the capital to the last bullet. It was propaganda reduced to a routine, repeated not to convince, but to fill the space between belief and destruction. Goebbels' last attempt to influence Hitler was in the last week of April. By then, even the most loyal officials were telling Hitler to leave the city. Goebbels argued the opposite. He told Hitler that his death in Berlin would turn him into a legend, and that staying was the greatest role of his life. It was a clever move of psychological manipulation, with the propagandist playing on the image he himself had created. Hitler agreed. The idea of surviving seemed less valuable than the glory of a martyr's death. Goebbels made sure that both of them would die not as runaways, but as symbols of a dying story. When Hitler killed himself on April 30th, Goebbels took over as Reich Chancellor for one day. He used that time not to negotiate surrender, but to prepare his final statement. In it, he accused the Allies of planning to destroy Germany and called on future generations to remember Hitler as a visionary betrayed by fate. It was the last act of propaganda, words written for a world that no longer existed. That evening, he and his wife poisoned their 6 children, then killed themselves in the garden of the Chancellery. Goebbels' efforts to keep Hitler's image alive in 1944-45 were essentially a form of self-deception turned into government policy. He had built his power on the idea that what people believed could be more powerful than reality. Even when Germany was nothing but ruins, he still thought that the right words could create meaning from the destruction. His propaganda didn't prevent defeat, but it made it last longer, tying millions to a dying government through fear, pride, and deadly faith. In the end, Goebbels became the symbol of the world he had created, a world where illusion was more important than truth, and where loyalty was valued above life itself. The record of his broadcasts and diaries shows a man who understood the psychology of power better than anyone around Hitler. He knew exactly when faith was fading and how to bring it back, even if only for a day. He turned propaganda from just trying to persuade people into a way to control their emotions. When historians study the ruins of Nazi Germany, they often focus on the armies, the weapons, and the battles. But the government's survival until the very end was as much because of Goebbels' words as because of its armies. Through radio, movies, and newspapers, he created a fake reality that lasted even longer than the will to survive. In 1944, he wrote that propaganda wasn't about truth, but about what people believed. In 1945, he proved it. As Berlin burned, he kept talking about miracles, victories, and destiny, not because he believed them, but because he knew that being silent would mean admitting the emptiness. His death didn't end the story of Nazi propaganda. It just showed its final result. A society so lost in myth that it could no longer tell the difference between faith and delusion.